Great. Thank you all for making it to the last lecture of this winter workshop, Ethology from Individual to Collective. And it's been a great experience for us. I mean, the fact that you guys have been really interactive and the experience throughout has been very positive. And then we have gotten very interesting emails from you guys, and we're really, really happy to see that there's excitement. You know, and we are happy to have nudged you towards that excitement. Okay, so this last lecture, again, we are going to focus on the modeling aspect. So just to recap, the first lecture was primarily an introduction to ethology, wherein you sort of saw the kind of problems that people have understood. And in fact, we have just come up with a course definition of what behavior or what behavioral science is, what ethology is. And in the second lecture, you got to see how to model collective behavior, especially in the paradigm of agent-based modeling. And in the third lecture, you saw inverse models, how to phrase behavioral questions in the context of behavioral identification as an inverse problem. And in the last lecture today, what I'd like to show you is introduce a slightly different paradigm of modeling. Again, this is all in the same model of modeling behavior, but slightly different in the sense here you account for a very important aspect, which is stochasticity. Okay, so that's going to be one of the main themes of today's lecture. And actually, there are a couple of questions that came up during the past lectures, and some of which I want to address head on with very, very concrete examples with respect to role of models itself. Okay, so we'll get started. So I think this is something that you guys know by now. So please, the mini project has already been shown to you guys. So that's, I know we've even gotten some response from you guys already. Okay, so last lecture that I gave, I blanked out on this signal, this plot that was there. So, and I went and looked at it, and it's nothing but the concentration that the insect sees at that location, at a particular location. So this is a video that I showed you guys of this housefly being confined to a surface, and then it's trying to find the source of the odor. So this is an odor plume, and the insect is trying to find the source of the odor plume. And in this experiment, the scientists had essentially characterized the behavior, a primitive ethogram, if you will, using the encounters, the orientation of the insect, the speed at which it moves, and then the signal that it senses. So the signal can be characterized by the intensity of this black color. So this is nothing but the signal used, signal sensed by the agent. Okay, so that's again, there's a small piece that was missing, and I wanted to just finish the loop over there. Okay, so again, in the paradigm of behavior, so there are three reference books, actually three reference documents, two books and one very classic paper that I'll highlight. One is this very classic book now. It's called A Kinetic View of Statistical Physics. The other is Non-Equilibrium, Elements of Non-Equilibrium Statistical Mechanics by a faculty from IIT Madras, Professor V. Balakrishnan. So you might think, oh, why should you know about statistical mechanics or statistical physics to understand behavior? Hopefully, I'd like to give a flavor for why it's useful. By the end of this lecture, you'll see this is a very, very useful utility to have under your fold. Okay, so these are the topics for today. We are going to learn some examples of stochastic processes, an example of a master equation, and then you'll see how master equation is connected to Fokker Planck equation, or the stochastic process is linked to Fokker Planck equation. And then briefly introduce this paradigm of reinforcement learning. I had already mentioned in my first lecture that reinforcement learning as an algorithm came about from behavioral science. I want to again make that connection very explicit. And in the context of some of the questions that you guys raised with respect to the role of models, I'd like to answer that through some examples, primarily from my work and our work, my work with my collaborators and advisors. Okay, so one of the questions that was asked was, what are the roles of models, right? So we're going to get into these examples through some of the processes that we'll discuss today. But role of models, it has a very important role in understanding behavior itself. One is they are a distilled representation of the task itself. So by that, what I mean is when you have your model written down in terms of mathematical equations or behavioral rules, you have essentially condensed the required information to encode the task. So there's a clear role of models. Instead of things being vague and up for interpretation, once you have models, so you have a distilled representation of the task, right? And this is a very, very useful perspective that, in fact, one of my friends, Gautam Reddy, who is a faculty in Princeton right now, we had a discussion, and this is something that came about, and I quite agree with him. So models have a role, or play the role of a null hypothesis. So there's this paradigm of hypothesis testing. So when you observe something, you have to come up with an explanation for it. So the basic hypothesis that you come up with can either be proved or disproved by the experiment. Right? So the models serve as a null hypothesis that can be tested in experiments. Right? And I think it serves as an important purpose in the broader sense of doing science itself. And models, as I say, have a crucial role to play. The next important role that models play has to do with the physical insights that they give into the behavior itself. It could be a mechanistic insight, or it could be a physiological necessity. So I showed this example of desert ant performing this brilliant navigation in the desert. And Wiener himself, you can see, has developed a very simple model. And in that model is encoded the necessity to be able to track distances and track orientation, right? So then over the next decade or so, people went and looked for the underlying neural circuitry that could perform this task, these two tasks. One is step counting and another is keeping track of orientation. And one of the big findings was that there are this set of neurons called the ring attractor neurons, which were found in Drosophila and its hypothesis to exist in several other insects, which keeps track of orientation and angular velocity if you want. Okay, so this insight you can glean only by developing a model, right? You know, it's the same is true of the cognitive map hypothesis that Tolman had, from the late 50s. Okay, so the models do serve a very important purpose. And the next is having predictive power. Once your model is consistent with experiments, it now has the ability to make predictions. And once those predictions are again tested, now you can go back and leverage this understanding for tasks, right? I'm going to show an example, a concrete example of this by the end of this lecture, but the predictive power is again something that the model beholds. The last is utilization, using it in specific applications. And one application that is of contemporary relevance is in robotics. Again, I'd like to hint that as well today. Okay, so that's addressing one of the important questions that was raised, and I think it's a very serious question that people need to ask as they are developing models, and this is sort of my take on it. Okay, so getting back to the modeling perspective itself, if you want to model an agent, so there are several ways of doing it. If you assume agents to be, let's say, rigid and point size, if you want, So the number of degrees of freedom, first of all, is a function of the dimension in which you'd like to model. For example, in the Drosophila example that we saw today as well as in the previous lecture, the housefly that tries to go and find the source of the odor plume is confined to 2 dimensions, right? So in 2 dimensions, if you want to model this insect's movement, you need 3 degrees of freedom. So the 3 degrees of freedom are associated with translation and rotation, right? So if you want to capture essentially a rigid object in 2D, you can capture it with translation information given by its position and orientation information given by its angle with respect to some predefined coordinate system. So in 3D, on the other hand, if you want to capture the motion, it becomes significantly more complex. In 3D, you need 3 coordinates to capture the rigid object, and you also need 3 angles. If you want to use, you could use Euler angles to capture this object, to represent this this agent in 3D space. Right. So this is something very, very fundamental to keep in mind. The complexity of your model, is expected to scale depending on the dimension you exist. The model also is going to change depending on whether you use an egocentric viewpoint or a geocentric viewpoint, right? And this is something that we are aware. I know there are a lot of physicists in the audience, so this is something that we have seen in physics. You could use either a Lagrangian perspective or an Eulerian perspective. The Lagrangian perspective will result in time-varying quantities, again representing the translation and the rotation, whereas the Eulerian representation of these fields, of these quantities, are going to be fields such as velocity and the orientation vector field. It is going to be a function of both space and time, right? So depending on the choice that you make of a model, whether it's going to be egocentric or geocentric, the representation changes, right? And the third, which is the topic of today's discussion, is how do you account for errors in sensing, perception, and action? And we have seen already that behavior essentially is this loop of sensation, perception, and action, right? So what is the role of error? Once you do that, there are 2 approaches, again depending on the egocentric or geocentric viewpoint that you want to take. One is this stochastic differential equation approach, and the other is the Fokker Planck equation approach. Okay, so I'd like to, at least before the end of this lecture, give a flavor for all of these, right? And I'd like to try my level best to condense it in the hour or so that I have. Okay, so we'll start with a very, very simple problem. It's a classic problem. It's just a problem in probability, and you'll see that once you have, so let me just highlight this point. So whenever you have error, the approach to take is really a probabilistic approach, because whenever quantities are fluctuating, you have the ability to describe them through probability distributions, right? So that's the reason why it naturally fits. When you have error in your system or fluctuation, the approach to use is a probabilistic approach. Okay, so let's start with a very, very simple problem. It's a classic problem. Let's say you have a walker which is moving in a one-dimensional line. It's a toy model, just to get some insight, and you'll see that this toy model is actually used by a lot of people in biophysics and behavioral community. Okay, so a walker is moving on a one-dimensional line, and every step the walker takes is of unit distance. Okay, so it's a one-dimensional line, so the walker can move to the right or left at any given point in time. Okay, so we are going to assume that this entire problem is discrete in time and discrete in space. So you can move at every time instant by unit distance to the right or left, and then the next time instant, which is discrete, it can either move to the left or right. So to the right, it moves with the probability P, and to the left, it can move with a probability q, right? And we know p plus q has to be 1, so you have q equals 1 minus p. So then you could ask this question, what is the probability of finding this walker at a location x after n steps? Right? It's a very simple question. Let's say I start at origin and I keep on doing simulation of this walker. Then I can ask this question at some distance x. X, of course, is going to be an integer because it can only move in discrete steps of unit length. So what is the probability of finding this walker at a distance x after n steps? Okay, so this is a very, very simple problem. And you could solve this. There are several ways of solving this problem. And the one way to solve this is to write this probability equation. The probability of finding a particle at x, position x, in n steps is p times the probability of finding a particle at a location x minus 1. So let's say this is x, this is x minus 1. So this guy has probability, if the particle were here, it has a probability p to move here, right? Or it could come from x plus 1 and jump to left with probability q. Correct? This is just, in some sense, an implicit way of just representing the problem itself. So the probability of finding a particle at position x after n steps is p times the probability from n minus 1 step at x minus 1 plus q times n minus 1 from x plus 1. Right? So from n minus 1, if the particle were here, it could move to the left with probability q. If it were at x minus 1, it could move to x with probability p. Right? So once you do this, there is only one more step to solve this problem. The way to do this is to write down what is the probability that the walker takes r steps to the right and n minus r steps to the left. Okay. So actually, I could have asked you guys to solve it. It's a very, very simple problem. If this guy is moving to the right with probability p and left with probability q, then we can find the probability that the walker takes r steps and n minus r to the left. It's just going to be a binomial coefficient. So NCR is telling you of the n steps, I can take r steps to the right, which means p to the power of r. That means q to the power of n minus r is the probability that it took to move to the left. Okay, and the distance that this guy traveled in this n steps is r steps to the right and n minus r to the left. So that's going to be r minus of n minus r. That's going to be 2r minus r. Okay, that's it. Once you make this rule, once you sort of identify this factor, then you can clearly see that the probability of finding particle at x is this. Okay, so you can solve this by just substituting, and for large n, what we see is that you can use what is known as the Stirling formula and obtain the probability of finding a particle at position x after n steps, and this is going to give you a Gaussian distribution. Okay, if you start a particle at, or a walker at x equal to 0 initially, then the probability of finding a particle or the walker at position x after n step is basically a Gaussian, and the Gaussian has the variance which is proportional to the number of steps and the probabilities. Okay, this is just a simple, really simple one-dimensional model of a walker that can either move to the left or right. But now we have calculated the probability of finding this walker at a particular position in space. Okay, as we'll see, this simple model has led to this can describe a lot of phenomena that we see in nature. Okay, so you can extend this model to continuous time and discrete space. Okay, So if you do that, so again, the same picture, let's assume that the probability of moving to the right is 1 and the left is also 1. So then what we see is that this previous equation that we wrote down, this equation becomes what is known as a master equation. So let me just spend a minute and explain what this equation is. It's essentially the same equation that we saw in the previous problem, except that now we are in continuous time. So the probability of finding a particle at position n at time t is going to be a function of probability of transition of particle from n plus 1 to n and from n minus 1 to n, right? So the rate of change of probability of a particle at n is going to be a function of influx of particle or Walker from n plus 1 to n, n minus 1 to n, and also it can go from n to either of them. Right, so there's going to be influx and then outflux, and that is the contribution that you see here. N plus 1 to n, n minus 1 to n, that's why the coefficients are positive. And there's a probability of these guys going to either of those sides from n. So that's the negative sign that you see here. Okay, and this equation can also be solved, and this also results in a Gaussian. Okay, this shouldn't be too surprising, because you know what this is telling you is, if this process is happening fast enough, all that this is telling you is, you're going to obtain sort of a continuous time version of this distribution that we have here. Okay. Okay, so let me move ahead. So what we could do from going from here is, you could actually go from master equation, which is continuous time, discrete space, right? Or this, if you want discrete states, discrete space. You can go from continuous time, discrete space to continuous time, continuous space. Okay, so that's a very, very naive way of doing this. I'm going to just show it nevertheless. I mean, this is a very hand-wavy way of doing it. There's much more rigorous way. I'm happy to point you towards references. I mean, it's a couple of references that I've shown are already good ones. They have discussed this in detail. So one hand-wavy way of going from continuous domain, discrete space to continuous domain, continuous space. Okay, so that's what we are heading towards. So one way to do this is just do a Taylor series expansion, assuming that the grid spacing is small. So I just do a Taylor series expansion, and I keep terms to order, second order, and you can see I've used the fact that delta x is 1, or the spacing is 1, and I can expand the second term as well. I just substitute this in the above expression and just replace n by x, which is valid, again, hand-wavy way of saying it's valid in the continuous domain, and you get what is known as diffusion equation. Okay, and I'm sure you guys might have seen diffusion equation from your undergraduate course on partial differential equations, but this is one way to arrive at diffusion equation from master equation. Okay, so I'm going to describe the properties of this diffusion equation a little bit as we go on, but this is one place where you can see that we have moved from this probabilistic description of a discrete space, continuous time, to a field description where the probability is now a field described on a continuous space and continuous domain. Okay, so this is, let me just go back real quick. So this is an example of the model where we have described things in the using fields. Right, so this is what I've done right now is just a one-dimensional example of this particular problem. Okay, so that's one way to derive diffusion equation, and this is used to model anything from behavior of anything from bacteria to human walking, okay, depending on the context. So this, though it's a very, very simple model, it captures a lot of it, and I'm going to show a context in which I have actually used this to model behavior of collective of ants. Okay. So I'm going to go shift gears a little bit and go to the Lagrangian perspective. Just want to slowly build intuition before we look at stochastic differential equation. So let's say you have an agent which is moving in the one-dimensional axis with some constant velocity, right? So we know it's very, very simple equation, high school level equation. You can solve this, and then you see that the position of this agent is just linearly varying in time, right? When the velocity is constant, the position varies linearly in time. Okay. Now we can make it one level more complex. Add complexity on top of this. Let's say you make the velocity a function of time. Then you can write this formal solution, which is x of t is x0 plus integral 0 to t f of tau d tau. And if you know f of tau, then you can integrate this. It's an initial value problem. And get the trajectory. Now let's say you make f of t a piecewise function. Right? Let's say the velocity for t less than half a second is something, and then t greater than half a second is something else. Okay. So you can again integrate this and get the position, and you'll see, of course, there's a kink or it's continuous function, but its derivative is discontinuous. Right? You can integrate this. You can do this in Mathematica. I will share the notebook in the Google Drive. Now you can keep on adding complexity on top of this. So where I'm heading towards is, instead of having a piecewise function, let's say now you have a function which is fluctuating discretely, right? If you add that, then you have the velocity of this agent being a random number. Okay. Eta of t is, let's say, noise or random number. And this noise needs to be described, right? You have to find a way to describe the noise. And one way to describe the noise is using two quantities. And this is the simplest example of a noise. Oh, actually, this is a typo. It has to be eta of t. I'm sorry. I'll correct this when I share the slides. So this is average of eta of t, and average of eta of t times eta of t prime. So this average, this angle bracket, is just telling you what is the mean of the noise. I'm sorry, this is eta of t. You can tell the mean, and you can provide the correlation. Okay. This is one way to describe the characteristics of this random number or the noise. Okay, so one is through the mean, and then the correlation. And the correlation is also related to the standard deviation. I'm not showing this, but yeah, you can take it as a fact, right? So if you want to add a random number, you have to sample this random number from a distribution, right? The simplest possible way to describe the simplest distribution that you can sample from is described by these two quantities. And that distribution is essentially what is known as Gaussian distribution or Gaussian white noise. So this noise that's being sampled from this Gaussian distribution, whose properties are that the mean is 0 and the correlation function is delta correlated, or rather the standard deviation is 1, is called a Gaussian white noise. Okay. I'm sorry, this x of t that you see here is all eta. Okay. Let me just repeat once. If you have the velocity of this agent or the walker described by a random number, that random number has to come from a distribution. And the simplest distribution that you can come up with is a Gaussian distribution, and the noise sampled from that distribution is called Gaussian white noise, if the mean of the distribution is 0, the standard deviation is 1. Okay, and this differential equation was used to describe Brownian motion of particles. And it was studied very intensely studied by this chemical engineer Langevin. And such an equation is called a stochastic differential equation. Okay. A stochastic differential equation captures a process. A stochastic differential equation is essentially a process, and the process is nothing but the description of an underlying probability distribution. Okay, it's a random process describing a distribution. So that's one way to think about this stochastic differential equation. So let me state it again. A stochastic differential equation is a random process capturing an underlying distribution. Okay, is that clear? So we're going to look at an example. So let's say I'm going to share the Python code for this. You have this simple equation. I can write a Python code to simulate this. Okay, so I've just sampled it to go from t equals 0 to 1000, and I've sampled this noise from the Gaussian distribution of mean 0 and unit width, and this is the trajectory that I get. Okay. Now I run the same simulation 100 times, again starting with x of 0 equals 0. I'm going to get so many different trajectories. Correct? So if we can capture the distribution of these trajectories, then we have essentially captured the distribution that this process represents. Correct? So that's what we are trying to do, so that we can go and connect back to diffusion equation and Fokker Planck equation, which is a probabilistic representation of this Lagrangian dynamics. Right? Is that clear? So that's where we are heading towards. Yes. So where we left was that this Langevin dynamics, or the stochastic differential equation, is essentially a random process capturing an underlying distribution. And we'd like to understand the properties of the distribution, then we can make predictions. Okay? Because once you have all the properties of the distribution, then you've understood everything about the problem. So there is a rigorous way of doing this. This is what is known as Kramer-Moyal expansion, where you can go from the stochastic differential equation to the corresponding partial differential equation representing the probability of this particle at any particular time. So we did a very, very hand-wavy version of this for the discrete space continuous time version, but there is a more rigorous way of doing this, which has to do with these two approaches. And I don't have enough time to go over it. And the references that I've shared do enough justice to it. So if you do that, you again get diffusion equation. Okay. So you see, there are so many ways of arriving at diffusion equation, and you can also solve the diffusion equation, which I'll show briefly, and you can generalize this Langevin equation to by adding further terms. In fact, this is not the most general form. There's even more general form. An important fact to keep in mind is that these are delta correlated, which is to say the noise that we are sampling, this is eta of t prime, is only correlated, the autocorrelation is only correlated at t equals t prime. Okay, so which is to say the randomness associated with, let's say, sensing or perception or actuation at one particular time instant is not related to the randomness at the previous time instant. And this is really a theoretical assumption that makes a lot of the calculations easy. But in real systems, in a lot of real systems, this seems to break down. Okay, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, though we have had enough success to describe a lot of the systems, there is still enough number of systems which don't fall under this category. Okay, there's more reason to it, but unfortunately, due to paucity of time, we're not able to discuss those. But just to keep in mind that this is valid only when the noise is delta correlated. So once you do this, you get a generalized form of slightly more general form, and this is not the most general form. This is an example of a Fokker Planck equation, and in fact, diffusion equation is also an example of a Fokker Planck equation. And I'd like to highlight the fact that we have gone from this egocentric perspective, which is the Lagrangian dynamics of an agent performing just whose velocity is just noise, to a geocentric perspective or an Eulerian perspective described by probability distribution. Okay, and in fact, like I said, you can solve the diffusion equation. There are so many conditions under which this can be solved, and a simple, very simple example is when you start the agent at x equal to 0 at t equal to 0, which is described by probability of finding a particle at, or the agent at x equal to 0 is 1, right? So this equation tells you the probability of finding an agent at position x at t equal to 0. This is the initial condition, and that's a delta function. That means when x equal to 0, this distribution, this probability value is 1, and for all other x, the probability is 0. Right? Delta function is basically telling you when x equal to 0, the probability is 1. For every other value of x, the probability is 0, which means the agent is starting at x equal to 0. Correct? At t equal to 0, you're starting the agent starts at x equal to 0. For this initial condition, you can solve this using very simple analytical techniques, and you get, not so surprisingly, a Gaussian distribution. So this is how it looks. So probability at t equal to, let's say 0.1, if you start an agent here, the probability of finding the agent in any other location at t equal to 0.1 is like this, and then the Gaussian distribution keeps becoming wider and wider. And this is something we just saw actually. We just ran the simulation of this, and this is exactly what we saw, right? So if I just take a slice here, the probability of finding this agent at given time instant is really localized to x equals 0, and it becomes more sparse as you travel across x. And that width keeps increasing, right? Just like the width of the Gaussian keeps widening as the time progresses. Correct? So this diffusion equation that we see captures the random process described by the Langevin equation, or in this case, the special case of Langevin equation, which is this Brownian motion. Okay. So we have seen the Lagrangian description. We have seen the Eulerian description, both systems without noise and with noise, and then we have seen that you can arrive at this geocentric or Eulerian perspective from master equation as well as from the Lagrangian equation. Okay, so this is one class of models that have had great success, and this is a very, very nice reference if you want to just get started and learn about this. Extremely nice review by this famous physicist Chandrasekhar. It was written in 1943. It's a good place to just get into the subject, and the other references are much more detailed. So the next part, I want to give a brief introduction into reinforcement learning. It's gotten a lot of attention, though it's not a new technique. It's gotten a huge amount of attention because of this whole rise of machine learning. But we'll see that it has it has its origins from behavioral science. Okay, so we saw that behaviors can be characterized by this loop of sensation, perception, and action. And in fact, a reinforcement learning algorithm functions exactly like this. Okay, so in reinforcement learning, you have an agent, and the agent is described by the state. Okay, so the state can be position, orientation, and other degrees of freedom of the agent. If you imagine a robot or if you imagine an insect, you can imagine that the state of that agent is captured by all the post data that you have, right? You saw that you in the first lecture you saw how to capture the pose of a particular agent, right? So you could imagine the state of this agent is nothing but a pose data if you want to describe single agent at the level of at the level of detail accounting for all the degrees of freedom, or you could have just their position and orientation. That is an example of state of the agent. And the action that the agent is capable of taking can be reorienting themselves or moving forward or backward, right? So associated with, again, the degrees of freedom that you use. It could be muscular torque in the case of um, post data or information from post data. You could imagine this is the muscular torque that's required to create changes in the dynamics. And there is an associated reward for a particular action. Okay. So this paradigm of, especially this whole reward paradigm, comes from these classic psychologists. We again saw them in the first lecture, Pavlov, and in fact Skinner was the one to propose this idea of reinforcement. And the reinforcement happens because of the reward. So the hypothesis is that actions that provide you reward are reinforced. So you want to take actions that give you better rewards. The interesting thing is, once you perform a particular action and you identify the reward associated with it, you move to a new state. Okay, which makes sense, right? If I am an agent and I take an act of moving, so I go to a new position. So my position has changed from, let's say, 0,0 to another state. So this behavioral loop that we saw, sensation, perception, action, is directly linked to reinforcement learning. Okay, so this has been exploited by computer scientists a lot, and there is a very simple model, just like we saw Brownian motion, model of Brownian motion. There's another model called the Markov decision process. This is again the vanilla model with the basic ingredients of reinforcement learning. So in this, what this Markov decision process describes is that you have a state and there is an action associated with it that takes you to a new state, and there is a reward for that particular action. And this particular MDP, or Markov decision process, tells you that every action that you say you take is disconnected from the previous action that you've taken. So there is this property of delta correlation between consecutive actions. So this is just made for as a theoretical assumption because it helps you simplify a lot of calculations, that just like we saw in the case of noise, where the noise was delta correlated in time in the case of Brownian motion, right? So this is sort of an analogous version in reinforcement learning. Okay. So because the decision is Markovian has to do with the fact that the correlation is only with respect to that particular time instant, and it's not correlated with the previous time instant. Okay, so that's the decision is associated with taking an action. So Markov decision tells you that actions are delta correlated. Okay, and you can state this slightly more formally. And in the paradigm of reinforcement learning, there's a very, very important terminology which is called the policy. Okay, so policy is described by this, usually represented by this term pi, which is nothing but a probability distribution. Okay, and in very, very simple terms, and in the terms that we have seen so far, the policy is the behavior. Okay, the policy in reinforcement learning is nothing but your behavior. Because what the policy tells you is what action should I take if I am at a particular state. That's what this probability distribution tells you. Okay. This is very, very, very important in reinforcement learning. There's like a direct connection to behavior. The policy that you see in reinforcement learning is the behavior, which is telling you what action to take if I am at a particular state. Okay. And the last terminology that you need to know is what is known as value function in reinforcement learning. So the value function is nothing but integrated reward if I follow a particular policy. Okay, integrated reward from my current state to, let's say, some future state. So let me just take a minute to explain what this means. So let's say I am following an exploratory policy, which is to say I'm just moving randomly. Okay, so my policy is a random policy sampled from some, let's say, Gaussian distribution. Now this value function tells me how much reward will I get if I start from a particular state at a particular time and then just take random policy for, let's say, the next 20 minutes. Okay, so I want to perform this particular task of finding my food source. If I perform this random exploratory policy, what is the reward, integrated reward I'll get after 20 minutes if I keep on doing random motion, right? So that is what is the value function. And this is a very, very important quantity because it tells you integrated reward for a fixed amount of time. It could also be infinite time theoretically, but in reality, it's usually a fixed amount of time. I'm going to show you successes that people have seen by using reinforcement learning to capture some of the behaviors, but this is the last terminology that you need to understand reinforcement learning. Okay. So there is a formal equation that we can write for the value function, evolution of the value function, which is the Bellman equation. Let's not worry too much about it. Now we can find the best policy to perform a particular task, correct? So ultimately, we have made this association between behavior and task. Again, going back to the first lecture. So now there is a policy or a behavior that can execute this task in the most efficient manner. So I can just say efficient, we have to quantify it seriously, but there's a best way of executing this task. And the best way is described by maximizing the reward. Correct? Let's say I'm an agent, I'm trying to find a food source. I want to find the food source in the fastest possible manner. And if there are several food sources, I have to now strategize such that I can maximize my amount of food that I can take from these sources, right? So there is this notion of an optimal behavior, which is nothing but optimal policy, and that optimal policy will maximize the value function, which eventually means maximize my reward. Okay, so this is this framework of reinforcement learning. And I'm going to show you examples where it has seen really, really good success. Okay, so this is an example from not so long ago. Let me just play this video. It needs audio.
If you want a better pump, you're going to have to get your hips low and then pick them up.
Okay, so before actually playing, let me give you a minute of context. So this is, you guys can hear me, right? Yeah, so this is basically a person trying to do skateboarding. Now this person wants to get maximum displacement, or let's say vertical motion along the skating track. Okay, so that's the task. The task is to get as much fun as possible, which translates to getting to the top as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's my task. Maximum fun translating to maximum amount of climb that I can get. And this climb is usually described by this action, or the way you climb is described by this the action of pumping. So you have to pump, which means you have to move up and down on the skateboard as you're standing. You have to stand up and go down in order to execute this climbing motion. So that action is called pumping. So that's the behavior. And you can ask this question of how do you get better pumping? How do you maximize this displacement? Okay, so that's what this guy is going to describe. So he's an expert. Actually, I've already flashed the results, but I'll tell you what those are. And this is the behavior that we want to capture.
If you want a better pump, you're going to have to get your hips low and then pick them up. Okay? It is so much faster. It's not even funny. Save that video that I just did right now. Put them side by side and see how much they actually change in height, and you'll see this huge change compared.
Okay. So this is the behavior. Now, people have used reinforcement learning. Actually, in this paper, they used an optimal control framework, but it's okay. They're very similar. So what people did was they compared experts who are performing this behavior, and they used reinforcement learning to identify the strategy. What is the best strategy that you can use to climb up faster? What is the best pumping action you can use to, climb faster? Okay, so what they found was the experts, you can see the behavior. I mean, forget about this, what quantities are being plotted. You can see this is the plot for experts. So the experts are performing as well as these trajectories. The black trajectories are the expert trajectory, and the magenta trajectory is the best policy, the optimal policy that is used, that the reinforcement learning tells you should be used for this particular task, right? So now you see that this framework that we have built is, can be used to describe something very, very physical, right? I'm going to give you another example again from the recent past. So this is a purely modeling paper that came out in 2021. So as we saw in first lecture, rodents can also track trails because of subsumption. These guys have the capacity to do odor tracking. They can also do map-based navigation. So let's say you make these agents perform odor tracking, and suddenly that trail vanishes. So what they found was that these rodents, this is from experimental data, that they can perform. They perform what is known as a sector search strategy. So they search for the trail because they have some estimate of where the trail was earlier, and now they make predictions of where the trail is, and they're trying to look for the trail somewhere, right? And this is something that was also found in ants. So ants also use sector search strategy, and they also do this sector search when there is no trail. And what these researchers found was that you can actually capture this prototypical behavior in a purely reinforcement learning setting if you assume that the agent is using past information to make predictions about the future. So that is an important aspect that they found. And if you use some more ingredients that from behavior, from rodent behavior and insect behavior, these are associated with the fact that rodents have nostrils and ants have antennae. So they're able to capture qualitatively a lot of the behaviors that we see in experiments. This is again a place where reinforcement learning has been used to make predictions actually, and these predictions are consistent. Though it might seem like a very simple prediction, but it's interesting to see that it has correspondence with what we see in experiments. So the last example that I'm going to show you is something that we recently did. It's out on bioRxiv. So what we studied was, we worked with this person called Bruce Jane, who works with snakes. So this is a snake that's trying to perform this task of bridging. So you have a branch here and you have another branch here, and the snake is trying to bridge this. So now you can again ask this behavioral question: what is the strategy that this agent, this snake, is using to perform this bridging task? So we again used an analogous technique to reinforcement learning, and this is the experimental estimates of the shape of the snake itself. And here is some theoretical predictions that we came up with using something like a reinforcement learning framework, where you have to make assumptions about what is the reward or the value function that the agent is trying to maximize. Okay, there are upsides and there are downsides to it, but I just want to highlight the point that models have the capacity to make these kind of predictions. In fact, from the model we were able to predict when is that snake going to be stable and when is it that the snake can no more be stable and it will actually fall off. So in this task you see that it's able to perform bridging task, right? So let's say because of physical constraints, due to amount of muscular actuation it can exert, it is no more capable of reaching. There could be a scenario where it's no more capable of performing this branching behavior, right? So you can make those predictions from the model. Okay, so I'm going to go to the last part of today's talk. How can collectives, given the constraints of their communication and interaction, how can collectives perform a task together so that they can maximize the reward? Is a very complex question, because it is often the case that collectives don't have a representation of the task at the fundamental level, right? So if I am an agent, let's say I'm an ant, and I have to transport this huge object from point A to point B, right? It is unlikely that the global task, the individual agent has a complete picture of what the global task is. So now it has to, so what you're asking is, how does this reward get trickled down and encoded at the individual level? And this is one of the big questions, to be honest, in the field itself. So that's a very, very important question. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make one last connection with the stochastic models that we've seen today. So what we saw today was that you can use stochastic differential equations or probability equations that describe the probability using Fokker Planck equation that capture the behavior of an individual agent, right? But you can also use these Fokker Planck equations to capture behavior of collectives, which is to say, if you have a collective sitting at one particular location, and let's say they are all doing diffusion, they're all performing random walks, what you would see, I don't have a video of it, it's very easy to simulate, is that this collective, even if you account for physical interactions, this collective is going to just diffuse out, right? So you can imagine that this diffusion equation that we saw earlier can be used to describe behavior of collectives as well. Okay, so which is to say, you can get coarse-grained, averaged out models to describe collectives. So that's the last example that I'm going to show you today. This is again some work that we did a couple of years back, where we used these averaged equations to model collective of ants, and in fact the model gave us a prediction that we went and tested out in an interesting system. That's the last bit I want to show you today. Okay, so let me play this. So this is the experiment that we did. We confined ants to a small ring, so that there's a light source at the bottom, the ants are on the top, and there's a small soft ring made of agar, and there's another glass plate on top of it. Okay, so the ants wake up and they find that they are confined, so they want to escape, so they have been starved, right? So they start biting together, Some of them try to bite at other locations, so it's like they're trying to strategize. And then finally, they come up with two tunnels. One of the tunnel is done, so they all escape out of this one tunnel. Okay. So we know from experiments that there is the connection between the ants themselves, and the communication, which is captured through their antennation, and the substrate, which is the environment. Substrate is nothing but this ring. Okay. So there is interaction between agents. This is through the antennation, and agents also interact with the environment. And the environment affects the antennation, and it also affects the behavior of this individual agent. So these three variables is what these three variables, the agent, the interaction, and the environment, is what people call embodiment. So embodiment approach to describing behavior. So the embodied approach is that the behavior of the agents can only be fully described if you understand the dynamics of the individual agent, interaction between agent, and the agent environment interaction. So these three variables are very important, and all of this is so only if you account for all of this have you captured the essence of the behavior, and that's the embodied approach to describing a particular behavior. So we came up with a set of equations analogous to Fokker Planck equation for the density of the ants. You can imagine this is nothing but the probability of finding an ant at a particular location. So that's described by this equation. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into the details. Just want to show that this also has terms like diffusion. It has terms like advection, because the ant can move forward, and it can also take feedback from antennation. And the antennation can also be described by an analogous equation, and that is coupled to what is known as the substrate density equation, which tells you whether the substrate is present at a particular location or not. Okay. Again, all these interactions are now encoded in the form of equations. These continuous equations, which are functions of space and time. So once we figure out the right parametric regime, there are several behaviors that are possible. We found that you can capture when can you get successful escape. So this is basically describing the probability of finding a particular ant at a particular location, and the amount of antennation they would create if they are at that location, and how that affects the substrate density. The red corresponds to substrate being present, and blue corresponds to substrate being absent. So once we put in this kind of interaction that's pictorially represented here, you're able to capture the collective behavior, right? So the reason I'm showing this is to highlight the fact that this model that we saw, which has probability in space and time, can also be used to describe collectives. Okay. And again, this led us to actually simulate them in a robotic platform. I'm just going to show, we encoded all the rules that we saw, interaction rules, into these robots, which were made in a lab. And the white field you see is nothing but the analogous antennation field. And this is just to highlight the fact that if you encode the rules inspired by these insects, actually we get successful escape, and these guys are all acting based on local interactions, local sensing, local perception, and local action. There's no mastermind that's guiding this behavior. So these agents are just sensing locally and then acting based on local interaction, unlike the traditional robotics approach, which is using global controller. Okay, so this is just to highlight the fact that you can use models to design robotic platform as well. And one of the predictions that we got from the model was that apart from just performing construction, apart from just performing tunneling, you can also perform construction by just tuning one behavioral rule. Sorry. So the models predicted that these agents can also perform construction if you just tune one of the behavioral rules. This is again to highlight one of the questions that was asked. What is the point of modeling? So this entire set of experiments were designed by a prediction that the model made, and we could test it in the experiment. So here we see that this robotic collective performs construction. So you'll see they're cooperating with each other. The cooperation can also be defined quite concretely. You have a parameter that describes cooperation, and at the end of it, they're able to make structure which are localized in space. So that's what we call construction. Okay, so we have actually come to the end of my talk. So the thing that I wanted to show you was that it's been really great to interact with you guys, and we just want to highlight the fact that there are other opportunities to get in touch with us. One is through the summer fellowship program. The applications for this program will be up next month. It's pretty soon, and we have put up the set of projects that faculty in our department are offering here. Please have a look at it if you want to continue interacting with us. And BTech and MS students from other institutes who want to do their final year project are welcome. There's a route by which you can get in touch with us and you can do projects with us. If you're part of a CFTI, which is a centrally funded technical institute, there is a very nicely laid out process by which you can come and interact with us. And the last way is to apply to our MS and PhD program, and we are always looking for interested students, and that's another way by which you can get in touch with us.